Welcome everyone to the next in our series of Climate and Energy College and SPIPA seminars. Just as a reminder, SPIPA is the Strategic Partnership Implementation of the Paris Agreement, an activity of the European Union in partnership with a range of international groups, including ourselves at the Climate and Energy College, interested in strengthening climate action around the world. The Climate and Energy College is very happy to be associated with this, supporting both some of the research and some of the networking type activities that we're involved in, including things like this seminar series. And as part of that, it's a delight to welcome today's speaker, Kennedy Mbeva. Kennedy is originally a Kenyan, but as his brief bio puts it, has worked around the world. And in 2017, joined us at Climate and Energy College for a PhD in international relations. And is another one of these heroic souls that has managed to complete a PhD on time during COVID. And there ought to be a special commendation for that. It's been a very difficult time to put together a significant piece of research, which he's assuredly done. And today he's going to talk to us about the kind of role and structure of the climate structural adjustment programs and kind of what their role might be in meeting climate goals. So Kenny, it's over to you.
Thanks a lot, Peter, for the very generous introduction. So I think I'll start by sharing my slides. They're all clear? Great. So thanks, Peter, for the introduction once again, and thank you everyone for taking the time to attend this session today. I'm very excited to share with you my presentation today. And as the title suggests, we're talking about climate change, but in a structural sense, and trying to see what these climate structural adjustment programs are and why it's important to think about them. So I've organized my presentation as follows. First, we'll present how we can conceptualize about climate policy domains. That's where climate policy happens. The second part of my presentation will look at climate structural adjustment programs and look at what they are. And the third part of my presentation will look at the implications of climate structural adjustment programs on how we think about climate policy. And I'll conclude with a few reflections going forward. So what inspired this presentation or the topic for today's presentation? So I'm currently working on a couple of projects, and while doing so, I've been thinking a lot about some of the themes that have been recurring. And one of the projects is a book project, which I'm co-authoring with a number of colleagues. It's called a book that is tentatively titled Taming Carbon, Africa's Development Prospects in a Climate Constrained World. I hope to publish it with Palgrave Macmillan next year. But in this book, we try to make sense of how the international climate policy landscape is changing very rapidly and the implications for Africa's development prospects, where the continent is really trying to reposition itself and transform the economies around, but there are quite a number of constraints imposed by the very rapidly changing international climate landscape. A second project that got me thinking is my forthcoming postdoc project, where I'll be looking at aligning the international economic system with climate policy goals. And I'll be focusing on emerging and developing countries, but some of these issues that I'll raise apply or cut across quite a number of countries. So in thinking about these two projects, some of the ideas that I'll present today were quite recurrent, and I thought they were quite interesting highlights of how the international climate policy landscape has changed in the last 3 decades or so. So how can we think about international climate policy domains, or where international climate policy happens? There are three main domains. Of course, the first one is the diplomatic domain, where we have multilateral or minilateral climate cooperation. And efforts to address climate change at the global level kickstarted with the formation of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change as the main legal instrument to address climate change. That's in 1992. But we also have the Kyoto Protocol of 1997, and more recently, the Paris Agreement. So these are some of the frameworks that have helped to address or cooperate on climate change at the diplomatic domain. We also have the multilateral climate change regime. Multilateral just means smaller versions of international diplomatic cooperation. And it's a kind of exclusive multilateralism where a few countries meet and try to coordinate their efforts diplomatically. In the climate change domain, we can see formation of climate clubs as one example of that. And one of the most salient examples is the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation Platform, which was created to try and coordinate climate change policy across a number of countries, not all, but just a small number. The second realm or domain where climate policy unfolds is at the national and subnational. This is a governmental level as well. So we have numerous climate change policies that have been adopted by countries. Of course, the most well-known being the nationally determined contributions. This is national contributions that countries have made after under the Paris Agreement. We also have climate change laws at the national and times subnational levels, and climate change action plans, strategies, etc. We also have subnational climate change policies where jurisdictions below the national level are also very active in climate policy. And here in Victoria, for example, we have the Victoria Climate Change Act of 2017 and a number of attendant policies. There's a third domain which is quite interesting as well and has been covered in scholarship and other discussions, and this is the transnational domain. And transnational in this sense simply means across borders. And we have quite a number of actors who are engaged in climate policy or climate governance or climate cooperation across borders. We have the nation states, so long as they cooperate across borders. We have subnational entities or sub-state entities such as cities who are cooperating across borders through forums, networks, etc. We have private actors, we have transnational corporations. We also have other intergovernmental or quasi-private actors such as international finance institutions who are very active in that space. We also have the civil society who usually collaborate a lot across borders. And last but not least, we also have epistemic communities of scholars. And I'm sure for the researchers that are here, many of you have collaborations across borders, etc. So having thought about those three domains of climate change, where climate policy occurs, you can think of them in a way that they're distinct in some way, but they also overlap. And this is what I'm calling the trifecta of climate policy domains. As you'll see, this thinking about climate change or climate policy this way is quite important. In the literature and in many other places, there are many discussions or a lot of research on each of the domains. But what I'll try to do in this research is to show how they relate to each other. And that in itself is quite interesting. Which takes us now to the next part of my presentation, which is on climate structural adjustment programs. What are they? Of course, you might, it is implied in that phrase, the concept of structural adjustment programs, which we all know, and they've been quite infamous. So the two cartoons that I have here that capture the gist of the structural adjustment programs, which were at their height in the late 80s and early 90s in developing countries, where those countries were really struggling with debt, and the IMF and the World Bank intervened, but with conditions. And some of those conditions are what actually made the structural adjustment programs quite infamous, if not very controversial. So the SAPs, they have an infamous history, and as I mentioned, they were interventions, but in this case at a structural level where the IMF and the World Bank sought to intervene and change the structure, the economic structure of the countries that they were engaging. And the key elements of this approach were privatization of state enterprises, liberalization of trade, and the deregulation of foreign capital flows. So there were other elements, but these were the key elements of the structural adjustment programs. But in my use of that concept and tying it to the climate domain, I'll focus on the structural elements where we look at how change is happening at the structural level in the three domains that I've identified. That is the emphasis. And the point will be that some of the changes that I'll highlight are actually changing the structure, be it at the national, subnational, international, or even across borders, that is transnational. climate cooperation. But the point is, this is where I derived the connection with the SAPs. So climate structural adjustment programs, what are the key features? Or what are their key features? So one is they are mutually reinforcing. And as I've mentioned, of course, there's the diplomatic domain where countries cooperate. There's the subnational and the national domain where governments craft and implement their policy. But there's also the transnational domain that is also very active and has various actors. But the interesting thing is that all these three domains are related to each other, and they reinforce each other. So changes at the diplomatic level, for example, the adoption of the Paris Agreement, had an impact on the national level where countries adopted NDCs to implement the Paris Agreement, but has also catalyzed a lot of action by many actors across borders. So you can see that aspect of mutual reinforcement amongst the three components of the three domains of climate policy. The structural in scope, and in this sense, the focus is not just on sectoral or some certain sectors, but it's on big structures. For example, the national structure, the international structure, but also the transnational structure. It's they are evolutionary and dynamic. That means they change over time. And this is a very important feature of these programs. And if you think about how climate change was discussed, debated, and especially in the policy rings 3 decades ago in the early 90s, it's very different from the kind of environment we have at the moment, where climate policy is one of the most important tools that we're looking at, or climate change is one of the big important policy challenges that we have at the global level. So there's been change over time, and the landscape has really transformed. So that's a very important third feature. So the fourth feature is we have multiple actors in that space. So initially, when governments were setting up those international legal instruments to address climate change, much of the focus was intergovernmental. And of course, there were scientists who were doing a lot through the IPCC to conduct research that would underpin and inform such efforts. But you could see in terms of cooperation, governments were at the forefront in trying to craft these international instruments. But over time, we've had many other actors that have joined that policy space, and we have the private companies, civil societies, etc. So one of the features of these programs is that we have multiple actors trying to shape climate policy in various ways. So just unpacking the aspect of mutually reinforcing in a visual sense, you can see developments that are happening in the various domains have an impact or influence on the other domain, and the effect sometimes goes both ways, but you can see that kind of reinforcement across those domains. So the issue of structural, as I mentioned, changes in the domestic structure, international structure through creation of all those international legal instruments and forum for cooperation, but also transnational relations. And there's this very nice diagram about the regime complex for climate change by Cohen and Victor that really tries to capture how that space is occupied by the various actors. About how it's evolutionary and dynamic, changes over time. If you look at, for example, how the issue of adaptation has been dealt with at the UNFCCC since 1992, you can see almost every year there are always every couple of years there are some themes that dominate those discussions at the UNFCCC, and that means you can see them changing over time. So that kind of thinking of some of these programs in an evolutionary, moving from one point to another, but also dynamic and changing is very important, as opposed to viewing them as something that is static and not changing. And the final point that I mentioned is the different kinds of actors that you find very active in some of these spaces. So we've identified the climate structural adjustment programs and the domains where they play out. What are the forces behind some of these programs? And one of the points that I'll make here is that there are 6 forces that I've identified that are very important, that are, number one, have introduced some of these changes, but also drive the changes and how they relate to each other. And some of them you'll be very much aware of, if not all of them. Of course, there could be more than 6, but I just try to identify the ones that I think are quite important. The first one is the issue of convergent climate targets, and net zero is the hottest buzzword this year and everywhere. And the logic behind net zero is quite simple, and it's balancing emissions with reductions of the emissions, so having a zero. And it's captured in the Paris Agreement, where the countries are trying to have a target of reaching net zero in the second half of this century. And that means that the, more carbon will be absorbed, or more greenhouse gases will be absorbed than are emitted. But the concept of net zero has really diffused, and many other actors have taken it up. And as we will see, what is interesting about this target is the convergence. It tries to converge actors towards a certain specific target. And that in itself is transformative in many ways, as we will see. There's a second force which I'll unpack, which is the diffusion of anti-fossil fuel norms. And as you could tell, in many places around the world, people are pushing back against fossil fuels, especially coal. And there's a growing feeling in the public opinion that people really don't support fossil fuels. There's another movement or another force which has been quite transformative, and that's the divestment from fossil fuels, be it in the private sector or in universities, but also from governments. There's a big push on that. There are fossil fuel bans where some countries or jurisdictions have introduced moratorium, but also some of the main actors have distanced themselves from or have banned certain components of fossil fuels. And the fifth force that I'll unpack is there's an emergence of a climate sanctions regime where some countries are looking at some kinds of policies such as carbon border taxes to try and get countries to raise their ambition, especially targeting countries that they think could do more, but are not doing that. And the final force we look at is climate conditionalities. And if you recall the structural adjustment programs, the regional ones, the issue of conditionality was very central to those programs, where, of course, countries that were seeking debt relief would be would get that debt relief, but on condition that they change the structure of the economies in various ways. So these are the main forces that I've identified, and I'll unpack quite quickly, and then we'll see how these forces have really transformed the landscape of the climate policy landscape. So if we look at the first force, which is the convergent climate targets, it's very interesting how net zero as a target has moved from the backwaters just a couple of years back to becoming the hottest or the buzzword this year and the last couple of years. And initially, of course, the target was having a global net zero, but then many other jurisdictions, be it the national, subnational, regional, etc., have taken up that target. And we have, if you look at countries or jurisdictions, we have countries that have no net zero targets, only 27%, but around 73% of the global greenhouse gas emissions are covered by net zero targets. In the EU, of course, that covers 7%, China 25%, US 12%. So some of these targets are just announcements, some are legislated, others are not. And there's a big debate on whether net zero targets are just empty or whether they are an important hook that can really help to orient climate policy towards converging on one point and pull all the actors towards that target. And as you can see from the second image, quite a number of countries have pledged net zero targets. Some have made it as a political pledge. Some have included the target in a policy document, and others have actually enshrined. Only 5 parties have enshrined a net zero target in law. So there's still a long way to go, but you can see how, in terms of structuring that debate on climate policy, these kinds of targets are. If you look at also some subnational jurisdictions, quite a number of them have undertaken some net zero targets, including Victoria, New South Wales, and South Australia, and many other parts of the world have sort of either pledged, announced, or committed to a net zero target. But the point is it's becoming quite ubiquitous in various regions across the world. And maybe the final point on net zero targets, it's not only governments that are actually taking up that target, but we have private sector picking up net zero targets, and many other actors picking up net zero targets. And so far, I think we have around, in that sector, 61% of emissions covered, around 68% of GDP, global GDP, and 56% of the population. So this is changing rapidly, and of course, one has to sift through the pledges and the commitments, etc. But the point is, a net zero is a kind of target that has brought some convergence that was really lacking or very elusive in climate policy. So the second point is the diffusion of anti-fossil fuel norms, and this has gone hand in hand with also the public opinion on climate change. And there's a big survey that the UNDP did, which is the biggest survey on public opinion on climate change. And you can see in terms of the groups, over 50% of the people who are surveyed actually believe that there's a climate emergency that needs to be addressed. And if that is broken in terms of regions, you could see also over 60%, over 50% in each of the regions of the people surveyed really think this is a very important issue. So that's very important aspect of force in terms of public opinion, and that goes hand in hand with anti-fossil fuel norms. We also have some developments that have really changing how we think about, talk about, and do climate policy. And we have, for example, Fridays for the Future. These are kids who are striking across the world. And for example, this was sometime in 2020, or I think 2019, there were 3,451 events planned in 2,460 cities in 158 countries. And Germany had 519 planned events. But you would see it's quite ubiquitous, and young people are very adept at using social media and other kinds of ways to connect and really ramp up the public pressure on climate change. There's also another network which I was involved in a couple of years ago, or many years ago, in setting it up, African Youth Initiative on Climate Change, which now has a chapter in almost 50 out of 54 African countries. And the point is, the initiative started in 2006 has been very important or integral point for young people in the African continent to engage with themselves, but also with policymakers at various levels to try and really influence climate policy in various ways. So the point being, such kinds of movements driven by young people have been quite a formidable force in really affecting climate policy. Finally, we have some scholars as well. They're not left behind, and Fergus Green does a very nice job in this article of charting how anti-fossil fuel norms, which is a phrase that he coined, have been proliferating across the world. And finally, scholars, other scholars also, and other activists are also really pushing hard for a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. And so far, I think around 2,185 scientists and academics have already signed. But the point being, you can see even scholars using their sort of transnational networks are really pushing hard to ban fossil fuels. And that's a very important force if you look at them, all those forces in aggregate. So if we move to the third force, which is very important in thinking about climate structural adjustment programs, is the issue of divestment from fossil fuels. Because the argument has been, if we need to reduce our emissions, then we need to shift from investing in fossil fuels. And you can see from this graph is 3 years old, but you can see, for example, the total assets of divesting institutions have hit more than the $6 trillion mark. Number of divesting institutions has been growing very rapidly, exponentially. And that is a trend that is picking up, and many other kinds of actors or institutions, also including some jurisdictions, governmental jurisdictions, are also picking up the divestment movement. And there's a big push now for governments to remove the subsidies to fossil fuels. So that's another policy arena where some of those changes are having a very significant impact on how we think about climate policy. So there's a fourth kind of force, which is fossil fuel bans, and the whole point is to try and ban fossil fuels. Of course, there's a non-proliferation treaty, which I mentioned, which is still an aspiration, but is gaining a lot of traction. But in terms of policy, we can see quite a number of countries that, for example, ban or pledge to ban the importation of internal combustion engine passenger cars. And some countries such as Sweden have a date of 2030, which is sometime in this decade. Others have around 2040, like in Canada, etc. But the key point being that that is a kind of policy that many governments are picking, and it will have significant implications, because even car manufacturers are thinking about a couple of years, internal combustion engines would not be feasible. So they're transitioning and moving more towards electric cars. Even more at a strategic level, recently China's president Xi Jinping mentioned, or rather announced, that China will not be building any coal-fired power projects abroad. And if you think about that announcement, it's very important in a strategic sense, in that China has developed a remarkable Belt and Road Initiative, which has gone global. And most of the partner countries building energy infrastructure, and they really need a lot of investment in energy, and China has been a critical partner in that, and that has been an integral part of the Belt and Road Initiative. Some projects have included coal power plants, especially, and the pledge not to build any new coal-fired power plants or projects abroad is quite significant if you think about the scale and scope of the Belt and Road Initiative and what that signals at a structural level. So there's a fifth type of structural force, which I mentioned, and this is the climate sanctions regime. And I'm sure everyone now knows about carbon border taxes, but also CBAM, the carbon border adjustment mechanism by the EU, which is a kind of carbon tax. So the EU sort of made policy waves when it proposed the world's first carbon border tax on some imports that are deemed to be carbon intensive. And the issue of border taxes in dealing with environmental issues, or as an environmental policy, is not new. And the debate, for example, unfolded in the General Agreements on Tariffs and Trade, that's GATT, the predecessor to the World Trade Organization, some around 30 years ago. But it's very interesting to see how it's now made a comeback, and climate change is the main target of such kinds of such potent instruments. And of course, the US, given its domestic political dysfunction at the moment, but the Democrats are really trying hard to get a border tax passed so that they could apply the sanctions or carbon tariffs to imports that they deem to be very carbon intensive. So you can see the EU has already proposed, and there's a debate on how that will be implemented. But the US, especially the Democratic Party in Congress, is very keen on passing kind of legislation or policy to deal with that. So scholars have also not been left behind, and there are quite a number of arguments that have been put forward for the need to have climate clubs that are based on a sanctions regime. For example, the economist William Nordhaus argues that countries that have high climate ambition should form a club and penalize others who are outside the club, who they deem not to have very ambitious climate policies. But also some lawyers have put forward an idea where countries that would like to use such kinds of border measures should form a customs union in a way that would not be inconsistent with trade rules, but that would allow them to penalize countries that are outside that club that don't have comparable climate policies. So the point is, there's also a very lively scholarly debate that is going on at the moment. So the sixth and final force I look at today is climate conditionalities. And due to COVID, many countries, more than 100 countries, many of them developing and least developed countries, facing debt crisis of significant proportions. And some are saying, some people or commentators are saying, this might be the biggest debt crisis in the last 3 decades or so. And of course, climate vulnerability has come. Of course, climate change is a big issue. COVID has depressed economies, so countries are in a debt crisis. And the IMF, of course, has a significant role in bailing out countries. But there's a call for the IMF to connect bailing out countries with climate policies, where money is advanced by the IMF will be tied to certain climate policies. So there's a debate going on whether that's a good thing or whether that's not necessarily a very good thing. But the point being that now climate as a conditionality is making headway into issues of debt distress and management of debt, etc. So if you look at, for example, final point on the climate conditionalities, countries are injecting trillions of dollars into the economies to revive them to deal with the effects of the COVID pandemic. And the OECD, for example, has been looking at those kinds of fiscal measures that countries are introducing and whether they're compatible with environmental or climate objectives. And we can see it's only a small fraction thus far that is quite consistent or advances environmental objectives. And if we look at carbon, for example, and we look at the G20, the recent report by UNEP shows that quite a smaller proportion of those countries actually tying their fiscal programs for economic recovery with climate policy. So there's a lot of scope, there's a lot of opportunity, but countries have not really connected that very well. So after presenting climate structural adjustment programs and presenting the 6 forces that are really changing the international climate landscape, so what are the implications for climate policy? How should we think about climate policy? So climate policy in the age of climate structural adjustment programs has certain elements which we should bear in mind when we're thinking about it. And the first is complexity. And you'll see the various aspects, especially the domains, be the national, subnational, transnational, and international, create a very complex environment. And as we've seen in the regime complex of climate change, complexity will be a common feature that we'll be seeing around. So what we need to do when we're thinking about the international or climate policy and governance is to think about it using a dragonfly eyes approach. And I got that phrase from Roberts and Lamp, who have written a very nice book that came out this year on 6 phases of globalization. And they try to make a point that there have been several debates or various debates around globalization. And it's good to, they're calling for people to really be more attuned to what those debates are. And in terms of crafting policy, one has to be aware of those kinds of contending narratives, as they call them. So likewise, in discussing or debating climate policy, or even studying climate policy, we need to have a dragonfly approach that can see or perceive all these different kinds of forces, all these kinds of changes that are taking place, and incorporate them into our thinking. So that means then in terms of crafting policy, we have to think like foxes. And by this, I'm connecting to the famous analogy made by Isaiah Berlin of hedgehogs and foxes. The hedgehog knows one big thing, but the fox knows very many things. So we have to know very many things when we're thinking about climate policy, and not just one thing. And knowing many things is being aware of, being on top of all these changes that are happening. The second aspect we have to keep in mind is dynamism. And as I've demonstrated, climate policy, now we are in the age of climate policy under conditions of disequilibrium. Things are changing very fast from the initial days when we had the UNFCCC, and then we had very simple arguments that like developed countries would take lead and undertake major cuts in emissions, and then to give money to developing countries to also support them in climate action. The environment is very different nowadays, and that's only part of a bigger picture. There are all these different things or changes that are going on in place. So if you think about it, that sort of shifts our thinking from that equilibrium approach that dominated the first 20 years of the climate regime to more of conditions of disequilibrium where things are changing so rapidly. The third part is synergy, and we have to think about how to harness the structural forces behind climate structural adjustment programs. And one of the ways of thinking this in a macro scale would be how do we align international economic and financial systems with climate policy goals? And there's a big debate right now going on, especially at the WTO, on what role can the World Trade Organization play in promoting climate policy goals. And there are many other domains, be it in finance, etc., where such kinds of discussions are going on. But the key point being there's a need to seek synergy between those different policy arenas. Of course, it sounds good that we're in a climate emergency and there are all these forces that are trying to change the structure to try and be more climate compatible or address climate change, but also normative issues. Some normative issues arise. What happens to the issues of equity, fairness, and justice? Do we, for example, have a blanket ban on fossil fuels for all countries? Or do we apply, carbon border taxes on all other countries that, the country deems not to have sufficient climate ambition, whatever that means? So there are all these issues that come up about equity, fairness, and justice that are not clearly articulated, for example, in the multilateral regime where you have the UNFCCC, you have the Paris Agreement that have some, clear norms, for example, common but differentiated responsibility that try to deal with these issues of equity and fairness. But we, in the very rapidly changing landscape, it's very difficult to keep an eye or embed some of these normative issues. So it's very important to keep an eye on some of the normative issues that are coming up. And a final point about how we think about climate policy in the age of CSAPs is thinking about policy entrepreneurship, and not just policy making, but policy entrepreneurship. And by this, I mean creative and imaginative policy solutions. And for the policymakers or those who advise policymakers, those who see opportunity or those who can connect the various things and think like foxes and look at the issues in a dragonfly's eyes approach, then they can come up with some creative policy solutions that would actually try to fit the conditions or would be responsive to the conditions under which they're trying to craft the policies. So that creativity would be very important when thinking about climate policy. So in conclusion, what are the key takeaway points from my presentation here today? One of them is that the structure of climate policy, international should be in brackets, is changing very rapidly and significantly. And we can see in the last few years, especially after the Paris Agreement came into force, the changes have been quite significant. They've been very fast-paced and they're very rapid. So that's one of the big points. The second point is, which I argue in this presentation, we are now in the age of climate structural adjustment programs, where many of these changes are not just ad hoc changes that do not have a significant impact, but you can see that they're really changing the structure of national, multilateral, but also the transnational domains of climate policy. So the structure is changing very, very rapidly. And there's a need for a dragonfly eyes approach for the next generation of climate policy and governance, in the sense that we have to be attuned to the various changes that are happening, but also the opportunities and challenges, and think about crafting climate policy by being aware of all those changes and reflecting that kind of thinking in the kinds of policies that we craft, or the kind of research that we do as well as scholars. It's also necessary to consider the normative implications of CSAPs, especially equity, fairness, and justice, which will not be subsumed under the exigencies of an emergency or the push for the structural changes at the expense of some of these normative concerns. So that's it. I'll leave my presentation with that, and I'm happy to have any questions. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much indeed. Hopefully I'm back on video and sound. Thanks very much for that presentation. That's a really kind of clear summary of the complexity, really, the axes around that are driving these policies, the complexity of forces and the kinds of responses, some of which seem to have been considered carefully and some of which maybe not, at least outside kind of the scholarly domain. I'm really interested in how much these normative concerns figure in the discussions of the people who are actually making policy. I think that's we may have an interesting discussion to have there over the next little while. I'm going to now hand over to, I think, Angela for moderating Q&A, but I'm going to take the kind of MC's privilege and ask the first question, which is, how do you think this rebirth, almost accidental rebirth of the structural adjustment program is being viewed by the countries and the people that really were hit quite badly by the last set? Is there a concerning sense of parallel impost of these programs, or is there more a sense that because this is a much more organic growth of different forces, that people are more content with the way the political process is building these programs?
Great, that's a very interesting question. And do I take a round of questions or do I just take them one by one?
I think basically, I think answer what part of that question you want, and then we'll hand over to continue the questions from the Q&A.
Great. So I think that's a very interesting question that you raised, Peter, on the rebirth of structural adjustment programs. And you can see the two kinds of contending forces. If you look at, for example, the least developed countries that are actually really debt distressed, they're struggling with the ravages of COVID, and some of them are defaulting, like Zambia. And of course, they have to borrow money, and the IMF has, is very central in that. So there's one part of it that has been, one part of that response that has been really commended, and that's the IMF bringing climate policy in its affairs. And that in itself has been identified as very important policy shift in the IMF, where it's not being indifferent to climate policy, but trying to integrate climate policy in its programs. But then there's the issue as well, for example, the normative issues that come up, and especially thinking of the first generation of structural adjustment programs is, okay, it's all good, everyone would agree, let's connect climate policy to debt distress. But there's those who also raise the point that who should be making climate policy for countries? If you look at a country that is struggling with the COVID pandemic, a country that is struggling with the debt distress, but also struggling with the impacts of climate change, should the IMF dictate where some of the policies or the policy priorities of that country, even though it's under the guise of climate change, which is an important problem? So it's that issue that needs to be sorted out, but that's one of the really contentious points. And just to give an example of how contentious the IMF and the World Bank's power vis-a-vis some of these smaller countries is, there's a time, a country that shall not be named in Southern Africa, that they had borrowed money, of course, from the World Bank, and they were had to undertake some changes in their legislation. But the session in Parliament had to be delayed until a senior World Bank official was in the chambers to okay the legislation. That caused a lot of uproar a while back. And so the question would be now, how do the relations between the IMF, for example, and some of these countries, how can that kind of negotiation reflect some of these concerns where the policymakers from these countries engage in a more constructive way, as opposed to IMF really leveraging all its powers and dictating policy for these countries. So there's a lot of constructive engagement between the IMF and some of those countries. But then, of course, that would mean normative issues being on the table during those discussions. But it's a very important issue.
Thanks very much, Kennedy. And I'll take over sort of the Q&A from here. And we've had a few really good questions come in from the audience. So I'm going to start with Jordan Nayatov's question. And Jordan, if you'd like, I'm about to promote you to panelist, so you can ask your question live if you would like to do so. Jordan, you should be able to unmute yourself if you would like to ask a question. Otherwise, in a moment, I'll ask it for you. No, that's okay. So Jordan asked, so given that justice means different things, so distributive, procedural, retributive, or restorative to different people, it makes it next to impossible to get consensus on what should be done and how to do it. But that's not the case with fairness. However, the main question then becomes, how do we judge for fairness? So the question is, how do we judge for fairness? Otherwise, how do we know that we do the right thing and that we do it the right way?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good but very difficult question, Jordan. And I think I'll go back to the analogy of the dragonfly eyes approach. And you're right to point out that justice means different things to different people. But when you're crafting climate policy, I think one of the one of the key things that can be done is, number one, broaden the coalition of the people being engaged in the development of climate policy. You can see that very clearly in some examples of just transition, even here in Victoria, where in the Latrobe Valley and elsewhere, there've been debates, on fine, we're shutting down these coal power plants. We have workers who lose their livelihoods but how do we address sort of the climate issue or the climate policy issue of shutting down these power plants, but also addressing the impact of that on these workers who have their livelihood tied to such. So the issue of that issue of just transition, for example, is one of the frameworks that is quite ubiquitous in terms of looking at the normative aspects of justice in the transition to fossil fuels. Of course, it plays out in different ways in different jurisdictions, but in a broad sense, just transition is one of those examples. So I think, just to summarize my answer, it would depend on the kinds of actors that are brought on board. And of course, each of those actors has their own agenda. And you find some of those actors that, especially those who are vulnerable or those who are negatively impacted, would come at the issue from a sort of a normative point of view. So I don't have a framework per se on that, but the point is to be more attuned to some of the normative issues that come up out of some of these changes.
Great, thanks very much for that. Sorry, we're just dealing with a couple of technical issues here. Unfortunately, it looks like Jordan wasn't able to unmute his mic. So we might move to the next question then, which will be from Rod Pickett. So again, we'll promote Rod if we can, and hopefully this works this time and you'll be able to answer your question live. So we'll give that just a minute. While that happens, I might actually sort of take a bit of privilege here and ask a question myself while we try and get that working. Okay. So obviously some of the drivers that you mentioned of those sort of 6 different programs, some of them have got a bit more of a historical weight to them that they've, had impact so far, whereas some of them, like the cross-border tariffs and the like, are just becoming really emerging themes. Do you have any sense of which ones are likely to be the key drivers over the next 10 years or so?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think, yes, money, where there's money and where there's economic impact, that'll be a very hotly contested area. Because when the EU mentioned that it was introducing the carbon border emissions, of course, India and China and a number of countries actually, push back and say, we've negotiated the Paris Agreement on climate change, which has a balanced approach and a more cooperative approach to how we deal with climate change issues. So tying, for example, importation of imports to climate policy, would disadvantage them. But of course, the EU would argue, their industries have to meet very high and costly standards. So for them to level the playing field, then they'll have to do that. And so in terms of the debate that happened a while ago, like three decades ago, some of these issues conceptually came up where, climate change and environmental issues have been mostly, issues of differences in different kinds of standards. That's why you see obligations for developed countries, some less obligations for developing countries, issues of means of implementation, such as finance, technology, et cetera, et cetera. But measures or programs that will have a big impact on the economy will resist some of the most, will generate some of the most controversy at this year.
Great, thank you. We've sorted out some technical issues, and I think Jordan has a quick follow-up, and now the mic's working. And once Jordan's sort of had their follow-up, we'll throw to Rod, please. Go ahead, Jordan. Jordan, I'm sorry, if you are speaking, we can't hear you at this stage. So we might go ahead and ask Rod to unmute to ask his question, if I could, please.
Thank you. Look, Kennedy, thanks very much for the presentation. In your domains and later in your, you talked about international finance, and in the later part of the presentation, you talked about divestment. Mm-hmm. But I would have, I wanted to suggest that it's actually been investment. That, and I mention in particular, perhaps pension fund capital amongst a range of institutional capital that has been actually ahead of governments and some of the various multinational institutions and governments that have shifted capital to, towards the net zero goal. I wondered if you'd like to comment on that.
Absolutely, and that's a very apt observation because, of course, if you divest from one part, the idea is you invest in another part. So the idea is to divest from fossil fuels and invest in cleaner, more climate-compatible energies. And I think those are like two sides of the same coin. And maybe I'd add a small component or addendum to that, which is the big debate in especially developed countries is decarbonization. But the big debate in developing and least developed countries which have limited energy infrastructure is how do you build in clean energy from the get-go? Because still a significant number of people don't have that access to clean energy. So there are those two components, investment and divestment, that speak to each other very clearly.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks very much, Rod. I'll now ask Dwight to ask his question. Just waiting for it to come back across. Are you there, Dwight? If you are, Dwight, please unmute your mic. Looks like we might have lost Dwight, so we might actually come back to his question when he rejoins. We also had an anonymous question, which is, do you consider the movement towards recognising a human right to a healthy environment, as evidenced by the recent Human Rights Council resolutions and a number of domestic and transnational constitutions and policies, another potential CSAP?
Wow. I think that's a very interesting observation. And I'd actually say that might be a potential CSAP. And the question would be also, what are some of the debates that have been there on recognizing environment as a human right? One of the implications that the various jurisdictions would be like people would sue, could sue to on those grounds. And you could so in, for example, in Australia, where there's a court judge that a duty of care, especially for future generations, should be incorporated in impact assessment for new coal mines. So it's such kinds of, even though disclaimer, I'm not a lawyer, but you can see some of those developments really having a significant impact. And if they gain traction across various areas, they might have a significant structural change in terms of law, but also how we think about human rights, et cetera, et cetera. So I think, yes, it's a potential CSAP.
Great, thank you. We'll now throw to Dwight, if you'd like to take yourself off mute and ask your question. And then I think we might finally have Jordan working. So once Dwight's asked his question, we'll throw to Jordan, please.
Is it for me now?
Is that Dwight?
If you hear me, then everything is okay.
Okay, I think that's Jordan. Go ahead, Jordan.
Hi, Kennedy. I did ask a very tough question. For your peace of mind, I have to tell you that I am asking this question since October 2008, and no professor from any university can answer this question. So I will give you the answer immediately, which I gave back in 2008 and on any presentations I did have afterwards. The answer is the following. It goes from each and every policy or program, we have different winners and losers, especially at different contexts. So we can judge for fairness by avoiding double losers, meaning that those who were losers before the policy must not be losers from the new policy. And I can give plenty of examples. For example, I am from Bulgaria originally. Bulgaria is the poorest country in European Union. In order to join the European Union, there was a requirement that we have to shut down our nuclear power station. So from 8 blocks, we did shut 6. And now, especially during the last 2 weeks, there is a dramatic spike in the price of electricity, not by 3%, not by 13%, by 300%. So it makes it impossible for businesses to operate. And also nobody knows how the pensioners who are getting 150 euro per month will be able to pay their bills. So we can do something if we are allowed either to operate the nuclear power station on full capacity, either if we are allowed to use our coal power stations. So you see, quite a complex issue. And when the previous losers are forced to be losers again, how can we judge for fairness?
Great. So I think those are great points, Jordan, and your answer to the very difficult question is quite interesting in the sense of not having double losers. I think that's a very interesting point. And of course, the question which will be for all of us would be, who do we count as winners and losers? And how do we think about, like what is winning or losing, and who exactly should be on the side of winning and those on the side of losing. So yeah, that's a very interesting point.
It is either you are better off after the policy was implemented, either you are worse off.
Great.
And this is different at every different context. And therefore, policymakers should look very carefully what is the distribution of the benefit at every different context, because there is no such thing like one size fits all.
Great. Yeah. Cool. Thanks, Jordan. I'll keep that in mind as well. That's a good point. So I think we have.
Yep, we've still got a couple more questions, and we are running quite close to time. Kennedy, how do you feel about staying on an extra few minutes? Otherwise, I can go to one more question.
That's fine. Happy to
No
stay.
worries. In that case, I'll ask Duarte to ask his question, and after that, I'll call on Neil to ask his.
Hello. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Oh, good. The system's working. Excellent. The question was I put to was essentially I'll come down to conflict between nations. I guess what we're seeing, if some nations are doing better than others, and I think you just mentioned something about the EU, for example, putting on extra taxes. And as we go forward, there'll be some countries will be sort of further down the track than others, and there may be some trade frictions happening. So how can we best avoid those sorts of frictions? Because we don't want to end up throwing missiles at each other over climate policy. So what's the best approach? I know it's a big question, but I guess I'd be interested in what your answers, how we should actually approach that.
Yeah, great.
Actually avoid it.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and maybe I'll give a big answer to the big question, and that will be coordination. And as you could see, now that all these things are happening outside, for example, the multilateral system, the UNFCCC and Paris Agreement, there will be need to coordinate climate policies at various levels, be it at the World Trade Organization and the various other platforms, but coordination will be critical in that.
Thank you.
Neil, did you want to go ahead and ask your question, please? And then I'll call on Sean for your question. I think that takes us to the end of questions.
Kennedy, I think it's great work you're doing, and it addresses a sort of complexity in my mind that there's been a lot of sort of noise in the media about how the process is proceeding. And sort of at the back of my mind, there's a question about, can we use your model to sort of get an insight to how successful we are moving towards Paris type of agreements? And so in your work, do you think that the model, the 6 factors, are mutually reinforcing and building momentum? And over your work, have you become more optimistic or less optimistic that sort of we can use your model to accelerate progress?
Great, that's a great question, Neil. And I think the short answer would be Paris. I view Paris Agreement as more of now playing an important role of coordination. And in that we see the Paris Agreement and all many arguments have been made. You need to do more because this will be in line with the Paris Agreement. So it's given us that very important hook around which to catalyze a lot of climate action. So in terms of model, as I mentioned, it's very there's a lot of complexity that is coming up from these, and there are many other forces which will come in. I think that makes me optimistic in the sense that even though the answer is not very clear, but if we have as many people as possible trying to tackle the problem from as many dimensions as possible, then that creates much needed momentum that is not necessarily centralized, but helps us to address bits and pieces of the problem, so that when you look at things in aggregate, then we might be moving towards the right direction. Whether that's enough or not, I don't know. But I think for my presentation, the key point is to keep an eye on all those developments and think about what is the best way of making them all work towards a more effective climate policy.
Thanks for that. Sean, did you want to go ahead and ask your question? We've then had one last anonymous question come through and then we might wrap up.
Yeah, sure thing. Thank you so much. Thanks, Kennedy, for the presentation. And apologies if this is totally like missed the point, or if you've maybe already answered this question.
Yeah.
But in sort of like my understanding, structural adjustment programs, and you mentioned them yourself, they've got a fairly infamous history through the 20th century with like sort of debt traps and things like that. And so sort of using that term in this climate context, it sort of automatically makes me concerned that there is some like negative externality to some of these policies, like, you know, perhaps like trade tariffs being based on climate, on a country's emissions. Like for Australia, obviously that's going to be challenging because, you know, obviously we have such a carbon intensive economy, but at least we're a sort of a developed nation, and we can, you know, potentially afford that somewhat more than a developing sort of global South nation. Are there any areas of concern with these sort of global policies that may have sort of similarly negative impacts as the original structural adjustment programs?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think using the term structural adjustment programs, you know, invokes those memories, and for good cause, because when you look at them in isolation, people usually just pay attention to the strategic aspect of it. It's good to have carbon border taxes that the EU uses its big market to do that. But as you mentioned, then big challenge will be sorting out, if you use such potent policy tools, you know, how do you distinguish those able but unwilling, you know, as some of the countries you mentioned, who can do more but they don't want to, but those who are willing but unable, who want to do more but they might have a few challenges here and there, and sort of how one sort of sifts those issues will be quite critical. So my key point is just to bring normative issues into this debate, debate on some of these changes that are moving very, very fast, and such issues might be left behind. So just by calling them SAPs or invoking that kind of memory, that really puts those issues at the center, normative issues at the center.
Thanks, Kennedy. Our final question is an anonymous one, so I'll go ahead and read it out. In the context of fairness in decision making, there is a lot of emphasis on current investors and current asset holders. Looking at the perspective of intergenerational inequality or inequity, how do we best manage those who believe that preventing catastrophic climate change and the associated 20 to 30% loss of global GDP in the future cannot come at the cost of returns of 2 to 3% of global GDP today?
Yeah, that's a very important question, and so of course concerns of future generations is very clear, has been very clear, and maybe 2 quick points on that. So the first one would be, of course, the argument that doing sort of taking action today is less costly than in the future. So that means a dollar can do more today than in the future, and if we do that, then that will reduce the burden on future generations. And the question is also about responsibility as well. Do the people who make the policies bear that in mind and reflect that, because we are more responsible relative to future generations for this problem. So there's that aspect of incorporating that into policies. So it's still out there in the debate, but I think how to do it concretely is quite a challenge.
Great, thank you very much. I'll throw back over to Peter.
Thanks, Angela. And thanks first to Kenny for a great presentation. I think what I'm taking away from this is a growing sense of the change in the balance of forces acting on this problem, where for a long time, I think if I'd heard a talk like this 10 years ago, there would have been 6 forces aligned against the possibility of taking significant climate action. It's a change, an important one to acknowledge, not by any means a job done, that one can now write, a significant body of action and force and growing momentum and interlocking process behind driving a change. And that's really relatively new, I think, that we would have had that kind of optimistic view. And I also want to thank the rest of you for making one of Kenny's points for him about the need for a dragonfly eye view, that the kind of 1,000 images and views that we take of this problem were very nicely summarized by the range of questions that we got. And this just points out that this eyes everywhere, fox-like approach to this problem is going to stay with us forever until we get on top of this. So thanks to Kenny, and thanks for all of you for kind of engaging and helping making the point.
Thank you.